Chapter 9. Early the next morning, Eleanor came to Ormsford and told him that they were leaving Storlock at once. Dark and grim-visaged, the Druid appeared at the door of the Valman's cottage without a word of forewarning. And while Will gave thought to arguing against such an abrupt departure, something in the big man's face and voice convinced him that he should not. Last evening, when they had parted company, there had been no urgency in the Druid's behaviour. Now there clearly was. Whatever it was that had persuaded Eleanor to make this decision, it was compelling. Wordlessly, the Valman packed his few belongings and latched the door of the cottage behind him as he followed the Druid out. It was raining once more as a new storm approached from out of the northwest, and the dawn skies were heavy and leaden. Eleanor led the Valman up the muddied roadway, his tall form wrapped in the black robe, his cowled head bent slightly against it. A steadily rising wind. A handful of white-robed stores waited to receive them on the steps of the rest centre. With a small kit for Will and provisions for the journey, Artak was saddled and shaking his head with impatience, and Eleanor mounted the black at once, a gingerness in his movement suggesting that his wounds were not yet fully healed. A wiry grey gelding named Spithill was given to Will, and he had one foot in the stirrup when Flick came dashing up, bearded face dripping and flushed. Hastily his uncle pulled him back into the shelter of the rest centre's covered porch. They just told me, he panted, wiping the rain from his eyes. I'm surprised they bothered. He glanced angrily toward Eleanor. Is it necessary that you leave so quickly? Will nodded slowly. I think that something may have made it necessary. Frustration and concern showed in Flick's eyes. It is not too late to rethink your decision in all this, he whispered, harshly, and would have said more, but Will was already shaking his head. Very well, I'll tell your grandfather what has happened, though I am certain he won't like any of it better than I do. Be careful, Will. Remember what I said about all of this having our limitations. Will nodded. They said their goodbyes quickly and gruffly, almost as if they were afraid to express what they were really feeling. Their faces fixed and drawn as they exchanged uneasy glances and hurriedly embraced. Then Eleanor and he were riding away. Flick, the stores, and the village became dark shadows that faded into the mist and grey of the eastland forest and disappeared from view. The Druid and the Valman rode west of Storlock, to the edge of the Rab Plains, then turned south. Eleanor paused long enough to tell Will that the first leg of their journey would take them below the Silver River, to a small village on the western edge of the lower Annar called Havenstead. It was at Havenstead that they would find Amberley. The Druid did not volunteer anything further on the matter, and Will did not ask. Rain washed over them in sheets as the storm worsened. Keeping within the fringe of the forestland, they bent their heads over their horses' necks and rode without speaking. As they travelled, Will's thoughts drifted back to the events of the previous evening. Even now, he was not sure exactly why he had decided to go with the Druid, and that disturbed him. Surely he should be able to explain why he had agreed to such an improbable journey, to himself at least, if to no one else. Yet he could not. There had been sufficient time to think about his reasons for making the decision, and indeed he had thought about little else. Hindsight should have lent clarity to his actions. It did not. Rather, he felt a lingering sense of confusion. Everything seemed to jumble together in his mind, all the desperate, incomplete reasoning, all the emotions that intertwined and coloured. They would not sort themselves out for him. They would not arrange themselves in a neat, orderly fashion. They merely shuffled about like stray sheep, and he chased after them, hopelessly. He wanted to believe that he had chosen to go because he was needed. If all that Eleanor had told him were true, and he felt it was, despite Flick's obvious doubts, then he could be one of great service to the elven people, and particularly to the girl Amberley. But who was he fooling? He had no idea at all whether he could use the Elfstones that his grandfather had entrusted to him. Suppose their power was beyond him. Suppose Eleanor was wrong in thinking that the Elfstones could be passed down to him. suppose anything at all. The fact was that he had made a rather impulsive decision, and now he must live with it. On the other hand, the impulsiveness of the indecision did not necessarily distract from its merit. If he possessed aid to offer the elves, he must extend that aid. He must at least try to help them. Besides, his grandfather would have gone. He knew that as surely as he knew anything, Shir Omsford would have gone, had Elanon asked him, just as he had gone on his quest for the sword of Shannara. Will could do no less. He took a deep breath. Yes, he had made the right decision in going, and he believed that he had made that decision for the right reasons, though they seemed jumbled and out of order to him now. What bothered him most, he realized suddenly, had nothing to do with the decision itself or the reasons for that decision. It had to do with Elanon. Will would have liked to believe that the decision to go with the Druid had been his own. Yet the more he considered the matter, the more certain he became that the decision had not really been his at all. It had been Elanon's. Oh, he had spoken the words as if they were his own, spoken them bravely and despite his uncle's warnings. Yet he knew that the Druid had been able to foresee exactly what it would take to persuade Will to speak those words, and he had directed the conversation accordingly. Somehow he had shown what the younger Valman's reactions would be, what Flick's would be, how the two would interact, and how his own comments would influence them. He had known all this and used that knowledge accordingly. Shir Omsford had once told Will that Elanon possessed the ability to see into the minds of other men, to know their thoughts. Will understood that now, exactly what his grandfather had been talking about. Thus he had committed himself. It was not something that could be undone, even if he should choose to do so, and he did not. But from here forward, he would be on his guard against such clever manipulation by the Druid. In so far as it was possible for him to do so, he would look beyond the words and actions of the big man to the reasons that lay behind them, the better to see where it was that he was being led. Will Omsford was nobody's fool. He had been looking after himself for several years, and he was not about to quit doing so now. He must be wary of the Druid. He would trust him, but not blindly, not without proper consideration. Perhaps he could be of service to the elves and to the girl Amberley. He did not reject that possibility simply because of what he felt about the manner in which his cooperation in all of this had been secured. But he would be careful to choose his own manner of giving aid. He would be careful to decide for himself whose interests he might best look after. He would accept nothing as he found it. His face lifted guardedly, and he peered through the rain at the dark form riding ahead of him. Elanon, last of the Druids, a being who came from another age, whose powers dwarfed anything known to the current world, and Will must both trust him and yet not trust him. He felt a moment of deep consternation. What had he gotten himself into? Perhaps Flick had been right after all. Perhaps he would have done well to have given a little more thought to his decision. But it was too late for that now. Too late as well for thoughts such as these. He shook his head. There was little point in dwelling on it further. He would be well advised to turn his thoughts into another direction. He spent the remainder of the day trying unsuccessfully to do so. The rain turned to drizzle as the day lengthened, then at last died away entirely in the cold grey of early evening. Thunderclouds continued to blanket the skies as nightfall turned from grey to black, and the air filled with mist that wandered at the forest's edge like a child lost. Elanon turned into the shelter of the great trees, and they made camp in a small clearing, several hundred yards from the borders of the Rab. Behind them, rising above the roof of the forest, was the dark wall of the wolf-skag, little more than a deeper shade of black against the night. Despite the damp, they managed to salvage enough dry wood and kindling to make a small fire, and the flames lent some warmth to the evening chill. Travel cloaks were hung on lines stretched overhead, and the horses were tethered close by. They consumed a sparse meal of cold beef, fruit, and nuts that they had packed before leaving Storlock, exchanging only a few perfunctory words as they ate. The Druid sat in brooding silence, preoccupied with his own thoughts, as he had been ever since they had left the village, and seemingly uninterested in carrying on in any sort of conversation. But Will had determined to learn something more than of what lay ahead, and he had no intention of waiting any longer to begin talking about it. When they had finished their meal, he eased himself a bit closer to the fire, making sure the movement caught Allanon's attention. "Can we talk a bit?" he asked carefully, bearing in mind his grandfather's many tales of the big man's uncertain temperament. The Druid stared at him expressionlessly for a moment, then nodded. "Can you tell me something more about the history of the elven people?" Will decided the conversation should begin there. Allanon smiled faintly. "Very well. What would you like to know?" Will answered. The Valeman hesitated. "Last night you told us that even though the histories of the old world make no mention of the elven people other than in fairy tales and in folklore, they were a real people nevertheless, just as men were. You said they were there, but humans couldn't see them. I didn't understand that." "You didn't?" The big man seemed amused. "Well, then you shall have an explanation. Simply put, the elves have always been creatures of the forest, but more so in the times before the great wars. In those days, as I've told you before, they were creatures of magic. They had possessed the ability to blend in quite naturally with their surroundings, much as if they were a bush or a plant that you might pass by 1,000 times and never notice. Humans couldn't see them because they did not know how to look for them." "But they weren't invisible?" "Hardly. Just difficult to see." Yes. There was a touch of annoyance in the Druid's answer. "But why don't we have trouble seeing them now?" Allanon straightened himself. "You're not listening. In the old world, the elves were creatures of magic, as were all the creatures of fairy. They are creatures of magic no longer. They are men, just as you are a man. Their magic is lost to them." "How did this happen?" Will settled his elbows against his knees and propped his chin in his hands, somewhat in the manner of a curious child. "That is not easy to explain," the Druid advised him. "But I can see that you will not be satisfied until I've tried, so I will attempt to do so." He leaned forward slightly. "After the creations of the Ellcrys, after the banishment of the creatures of evil magic from the earth, the elves and their fairy brethren drifted apart once more. It was natural enough that this should happen, since they had united in the first place only for the purpose of defeating their common enemy, and once that was accomplished, there was little left to keep them together. Beyond their general concern in preserving the earth as a homeland, they had almost nothing in common. Each species of creature had its own way of life, its own habits, its own interests. Elves, dwarves, sprites, gnomes, trolls, witches, and all of the rest were as different from each other as the beasts of the forest from the fish in the sea. Humankind had not yet begun to emerge from its early primitive existence, and would not do so for hundreds of years to come. The fairy creatures paid the humans little attention, and indeed there seemed little reason to do so. After all, at this stage in time, humans were simply a higher form of animal life, possessing greater innate intelligence than other animals, but lesser instincts. The elves and their brethren did not foresee the influence that humans would eventually have upon the development on the earth. The Druid paused. It was something they could have foreseen, had they paid closer attention to the differences between themselves and humankind. Two differences were of a particular importance. The elves and their brethren did not procreate rapidly. Humans did. The elves, for example, were one of the more populous fairy people, yet their longer lifespans resulted in fewer births, Many of the other fairy creatures gave birth only once every several hundred years, but humans had frequent multiple births within the family unit, and their population grew quickly. In the beginning, the creatures of magic far outnumbered the humans. Within 1,000 years' time, that situation reversed itself dramatically. Thereafter, the human population expanded steadily, while the fairy population began to diminish. But I'll get to that in a moment. The second difference between the elves and their brethren and humankind had to do with the ability to adapt, or lack thereof. The elves were creatures of the forestland. They seldom left the shelter of their woods. It was the same with the most of the others. Each resided within a particular geographic area, a carefully bounded terrain. It had always been so. Some lived within the forests, some within the rivers and seas, some within the mountains, some within the plainlands. They had adapted their way of life to the terrain that served as their homeland. They could not and would not live anywhere else. But humans were more adaptable. They lived everywhere. The forests, the rivers, the mountains, the plains, they claimed it all. Thus, their expansion as their population grew came naturally, easily. They adapted to any change in environment. The elves and their brethren resisted all change. Eleanor paused, then smiled faintly. There was a time, Will Ormsford, when life in the old world was much as life is now, when humans lived and worked and played much as the races do in this world. Does that surprise you? Will nodded. A little, I guess. The druid shook his head. There was such a time. It was then that the elves should have come forward and joined with humans to shape their world, but they did not. Neither they nor their brethren. They chose instead to remain hidden within their forest land, observers only, still believing that their own existence would not be affected by the development of humankind. They saw no threat to themselves. The humans possessed no magic, and their ways were not destructive. Not then. So the elves kept to their policy of isolation, foolishly thinking it could always be so. It was their undoing. The human population continued to expand and to develop. As time wore on, they learned of the elves and their brethren, but because the fairy creatures chose concealment as their way of life, they earned the distrust of humans. They were deemed creatures of ill fortune, creatures who spied and connived against others, creatures who performed acts of mischief, and whose favourite pastime was to discover new ways of making the lives of hard-working humans more difficult. There was some truth to the charges, since a few of the fairy creatures did indeed delight in tormenting humans with small acts of enchantment, but by and large the reputation was undeserved. In any case, the elves and their brethren chose to ignore it all. The attitude of humankind toward them did not concern them. Their sole concern was with the preservation and protection of the land and the living things within it, and this they could accomplish very well, despite the ill feelings humans bore them. Then even this state of affairs began to change. Humans continued to populate the earth with increasing rapidity, growing, expanding, now building cities and fortresses, now sailing the seas in search of new lands, now pushing back the wilderness about them. They began for the first time seriously to affect the character of the land, changing whole regions for habitation and consumption needs. The elves were forced to move deeper and deeper into the forestlands that were their homes. As the human population cut away the trees and brush, all of the fairy creatures found their homeland being encroached upon by this expansion until finally, for some, there were no homes at all. But didn't they resist this intrusion? Will interrupted suddenly. It was far too late for that, Eleanor replied. His smile bitter. By this time many of the fairy creatures had become extinct, some by failure to reproduce sufficient young, some by their failure to adapt to a changing environment. Those who remained were no longer able to unite as they once had done. It had been hundreds of years since their war with the fairy creatures of evil magic, and they had scattered far and wide about the earth and long since lost contact with one another. Worst of all, they no longer had their own magic. When the evil magic had flourished upon the earth, there had been need for good magic to withstand it. But once the evil had been banished, the need for the good magic was past. The fairy creatures ceased using most of it. As time passed, much of it was forgotten, although altogether. Human beings used no magic of any consequence, so the elves and their brethren saw no need for the very powerful magic that had once been employed to defeat their evil counterparts. By the time they recognized the need for it again, it was lost to them, all but a small part of it. Thus, their resistance to the expansion of the human population into their homelands was weakened badly. At first, they fought very hard, using all the power they still possessed to stop what was happening. It availed them nothing. There were too many humans, and too few of them. The magic was ineffective. It won them small victories, brief respites. Nothing more. They were simply overwhelmed in the end, driven from their homes to find new ones, or to perish. Driven out in the final analysis by science and technologies against which they had no real defense. And the elves? What of them? Will asked quietly. They learned to survive. Their population dwindled, but they did not become extinct as did so many of the others. They remained within their forest land, moving steadily deeper